Exploded today.
I think I underestimated how big it was. I started like maybe something like, wait a second, I need to like.
So certain elements leave nitrogen oxide. So the air settling fluid was fine. I didn't have to.
I'll try what I did.
But every time you switch it over to nitrogen, that's when.
And I won't let you know.
Never sent a real fast box in work, I never got it. And then you realize that it was the wrong part of it. Sorry, but it's $2,000 shoot. So we'll see what happens. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to take one.
Like normally I get introduced to it.
The last time it exploded, I think.
Today. She's out of town. Absolutely. Are those stones? What are those? They look like feathers on them. They are. So beautiful. Nice.
Thank you all for coming to the UK Forestry seminar. I'm Tara Littlefield. I'm going to introduce myself. Let's see, let me double check. We're doing hybrid, so there's several folks that are calling in. So we've got some folks on the call too. Hello, virtual world. I hope that everyone can hear me. Okay.
They're there.
I think it's working. So I'm Tara Littlefield. Some of you know me and some of you do not. So I'm a botanist and ecologist. I work for the state for the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, and I've done that professionally for a while. But my recent adventure is being a PhD student here at the University of Kentucky in the Forestry Department. I'm a second-year PhD student, and today I'm going to provide you with the background, the current status, and the future status of my research project. So I think in order for you to see this, I might need to thank you, Laura. All right, so currently my title is Recovering Rare Plants and Restoring Lost Landscapes in the Cumberland Plateau and Mountains region of Kentucky. Professionally, I've worked a lot on rare species recovery, rare plants, rare natural community restoration, and that's what my dissertation is about as well. And it's the title is more broad because of the multiple scale approach and multiple groups and communities that I study, while also, the approach I take with rare plant recovery here in Kentucky. But the real star of the show for my dissertation is the white Fringeless orchid. So this is an orchid that occurs in 6 states in the southeastern United States. Kentucky being one of them. It is an absolutely gorgeous orchid. As you can see here, it's also called the monkey-faced orchid, and I don't know if you could see this, but the orchid here with its modified petals, you could kind of see this is kind of an arm, and the modified spur, the modified petal here kind of looks like a monkey's tail. Those are the names of the orchid. It's a very rare orchid. So in general with orchids, how many orchids do you think occur in Kentucky? Anybody have a guess?
10.
10?
25.
30? Rob, you have an advantage. So you're very close, 44. Very good, Rob the botanist there. So we have 44 orchids in the state, and over half of them are rare and declining. So orchids also have this really unique relationship with fungal symbionts and pollinators, and that makes them even more interesting to study. And a lot of them are also associated with really unique habitats, like the white Fringeless orchid. So this plant occurs in wetlands in the southeastern US, and in some populations where there's a lot of flowers, they kind of look like little ghosts floating above the ferns and the grasses. So super cool plant. It also has in populations that have a lot of flowers, a really, really nice scent. It's very, 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 very fragrant. You can almost make a perfume out of it. And this is presumably to attract its pollinators. Let's see if so it's pollinated primarily by swallowtails. And Dr. Zettler, who is on the call, he's on my committee, he's zooming in from Illinois College. He also studied white Fringeless orchid for his PhD, and he was one of the first folks to study the pollination schemes of white Fringeless orchid. So super cool. I'm not going to really go into pollination. My dissertation and research mostly focuses on the orchids itself and in the ecology and the trends and management effects But just to let you know, there's some really cool pollination stuff going on. Well, Dr. Zettler's studies showed that it pollinates the orchid, but it doesn't effectively fit its head fully into the orchid. And it's thought that there's a sphinx moth that also pollinates this, but we have not been able to find that yet. So as a part of this project, there is additional pollinator studies that I'll put at the very end. I won't go into that too much. Dr. Zettler also studied the mycorrhizal fungal symbiont of this orchid, and that's not the focus of my research either. My fellow PhD student Megan Newland is studying the fungal symbiont of white Fringeless orchid, and that's the focus of her dissertation. But obviously, studying this orchid, it has to have this fungus and it has to have pollinators. So it's extremely important to know about these two associations for restoration, successful restoration. But more importantly, the plant needs suitable habitat. So it needs wetland habitat. And across its range, over the past several hundred years, there's been so much habitat loss in general throughout its range. We all know how much the earth and landscapes have changed due to anthropogenic means primarily. And the impacts to this orchid are no different than a lot of other rare species. With development and agriculture, intense logging, fire suppression, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Orchids have an additional threat with herbivory, deer love orchids, and also sometimes with poaching as well. So range-wide, the orchid occurs in 6 different states. In Kentucky, we're at the northern part of its range up here, and that's where all of our study sites occur up here. And they occur in 2 main regions in Kentucky. I'll go over the Cumberland Plateau region first, just briefly, a little bit of background. Most of our white Fringeless orchid populations occur in this region. This is one of the most biodiverse areas in the state, plants and animals. This region is characterized by a deeply dissected plateau. So it's not high elevation mountains. The uplands are kind of rolling, and then there's deep that are carved by wild rivers. In this region, like the Rockcastle River, Big South Fork, sandstone cliffs, rock houses. The habitats and the rarity in these regions are really unique. There's a lot of glacial relics and endemism, a lot of rarity because of the microclimates of the deep gorges. The prairies of the river on these wild river systems are really unique. And in the uplands, where the orchid occurs, orchids occur in these headwater seeps in the uplands in this region. And adjacent to the seeps are what we think historically were pine oak savannas. And this is also the area, if you know, the red cockaded woodpecker that occur in this region. And so also, this is more southeastern, so it's got more coastal plain influence in the flora and fauna. And so if you know anything about the red cockaded woodpecker, it's associated with long pine savannas down in the south. It disappeared in the early 2000s, along with a lot of other rare plants that were associated with that habitat. And the white Fringeless orchid, we think it was associated with the savanna as well. So in far southeastern Kentucky, in the mountains region, this is the Cumberland Mountains region, we only have 1 white Fringeless orchid population there, and it's actually more recently discovered. And a really interesting habitat, a little bit different, higher elevation mountains. So, this is where you get like Pine Mountain and Cumberland Mountain. And the habitats here, the wetlands are along mountain streams. So they're more alluvial and stream sides. So a little bit different disturbances involved in the community there. associated with the higher elevation Appalachian Mountains. You get a lot more influence from those regions. There's still some glacial relics and interesting disjuncts from the north, but not as much coastal plain influence. So the habitats that white Fringeless Orchid occurs in the Cumberland Plateau are primarily acidic headwater seeps and bogs, and then in the Cumberland Mountains, the mountain streamside bogs. So I'll touch on the habitats just briefly. So most of the populations of white Fringeless Orchid that we know are in more closed forested seeps in these upland systems, and they're generally low gradient. The forested seeps have generally really low numbers of white Fringeless Orchid, vegetative, many flowers. We're lucky in the Cumberland Plateau region in this area that there is a lot of federal land, a lot of protected land, so a lot of sites that we can more easily work with. But this area did have a lot of more intense logging, 70s and 80s. The inventories and the discovery of a lot of these white Fringeless Orchid populations occurred in the late 80s, early 90s, just after a lot of these areas were logged, the uplands were logged. And then also, some of you might be familiar, there's a lot of short-lived pine in these uplands, and the pine beetle that came through Kentucky at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s really impacted the uplands in this region as well. These seeps in the plateau, the forested ones, have a lot of hydrologic issues. They just seem to be drying out. The populations are low, and in general, the systems here seem to have a threat of a lack of fire. In the same area, you get power lines that cut through some of these forested blocks, and some of the power lines go over seeps, and it's these more open seep systems where you get a little bit more flowering white Fringeless orchids. They're more herbaceous dominated, more flowering forbs, more just a thicker herbaceous layer and less canopy and mid-story and shrub layers. So their prone to mismanagement, partnerships with utilities and keeping your fingers crossed, there's still two populations that occur on power lines, and a couple, and they're doing pretty good there. So this is what got us thinking that these open power line systems, open systems where you get a lot of flowering orchids, got us thinking about, well, what would naturally make these openings? What is the natural? So the mountain bogs, this is that one site in Bell County in the higher elevation bogs. These habitats occur along these higher elevation mountain streams. Sometimes they're abandoned channels. They're more beaver influenced. I don't think fire was as big of a factor here. In general, higher elevation, the vegetation is taller. The Cumberland Plateau, the cinnamon and royal ferns get to your knees. In the mountains, they're above your head. So there's a lot more competition with the orchids. And in the plots that I've got here, you literally have to dig through the ferns in order to see the plants. So disturbance is obviously an important factor here because the plants can't flower. Those was so that's the three general different types of communities that we're seeing that have white Fringeless orchid. And what kind of natural disturbances occurred in these communities? And I think that a large disturbance factor historically from Jacob saying that they can't hear you. So for some reason the owl is or some people
that's the owl. The owl is.
That's okay.
Let's just put you. Like that. Is that better?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Anybody?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me the whole time? No? Okay, well, hopefully that works. The hybrid system makes me a little bit more scatterbrained. It's a little harder to juggle both. Okay, so natural disturbances. Mary, just let me know if there's any more text. Natural disturbances in these systems, I think a large one was old growth tip-up mounds in the adjacent uplands and in the seeps around the seep edges. Large trees would fall and create debris dams and improve wetland conditions and create large openings. And back in the day, there used to be a lot larger trees. These tip-up mounds, several hundred years ago could have created some pretty significant large disturbances, particularly in windstorms and things like that. We still see smaller tip-up mounds that help maintain the wetlands even today, but historically, I think this was much of a larger factor. Grazing by ungulates. This is one of those double-edged swords. Historically, we had migrating megafauna through Kentucky, and in the plateau, there's old bison trails and Native American activity, and 20,000 years ago, Pleistocene animals like mastodons and things like that running around, and no doubt when they're traveling through these uplands, they probably would pop into a little wetland and help maintain by browsing and opening up the mid-story. So that was certainly a factor. And I did mention, herbivory is an issue with orchids. And so it is a double-edged sword in terms of, ungulates help browse woody vegetation and keep things open, but they also love to eat orchids. So beavers, everyone loves a beaver. I do. Natural wetland engineers, and no doubt that beavers definitely in the mountains were a disturbance factor. And I think even though we don't see beaver activity in the Cumberland Plateau populations, I think historically they definitely played a role, particularly in the higher upland areas around Corbin and Somerset that are now all destroyed. So, and fire, of course, fire was a huge factor, I think. Indirectly and directly, these seeps would burn around the edges, but it's the adjacent uplands that were also fire-driven systems, these savannas and prairies, and in a large landscape, if you have a fire going through a savanna complex system with these wetlands interdispersed, the wetlands will also get managed with fire as well. And so I think in certain years when it was particularly dry, possibly the fire would go through the seeps and help maintain the openings. So focusing back in on white frontage orchid populations in Kentucky. This is all of the populations. I first started getting involved with white frontage orchid in 2007, conducting the status surveys for Kentucky. What I saw in a lot of the populations were really low population numbers, lots of Ds, D-ranked populations, trending down, a lot of declines. And the habitats were drying up, a lot of just the quality was decreasing. And several of them had become extirpated. We couldn't find them anymore. The habitat wasn't that great anymore. We are lucky here that most of them are on federal lands. And then we at Nature Preserves purchased a private site in the late 90s. And then there's still one on private land. So we knew there was issues with the white Fringeless orchid population declines and habitat quality. So, and we knew we needed to do restoration on some of these on all of the populations. So we started a pilot study on our state nature preserve in 2009. So at the time, this preserve had a D-ranked population. So this is what, when I started studying white Fringeless orchid in our seep, this is what the seep looked like. I know Mary knows this well. This is one of those giant monster maples that had been logged and then resprouted. And this doesn't really look too much like a wetland to me, but it still is a wetland. There's some ferns, some cinnamon ferns, and there was a few orchids. None of them were flowering, just vegetative orchids. The site was really dry, very thick mid-story and shrub layer, and these crazy monster maples everywhere. Obviously, land use, it was logged, lots of damage, and all of the hardwoods that came into the seeps were just sucking it dry. And then every once in a while, there would be a flower or two that would actually flower, and then it would get browsed by deer. So our goals and objectives here were to improve the white Fringeless orchid population viability and vigor by restoring the wetland habitat. And we knew we had to restore the wetland habitat by implementing management that mimics historic natural disturbances. And so we partnered with University of Kentucky. So Dr. Barton, he is my main advisor. I also got my master's with Dr. Barton as well, but a few years later, when we started this project, we partnered with him. We knew there was hydrologic issues in the seeps, and he had some ideas on how we could partner and improve the wetland conditions. So this is the site of our nature reserve in Pulaski County, and the plots. We first started with these three main seeps. There's some peripheral seeps that don't have white Fringeless orchid that we added to the study later. So this is just the distribution of them. And we started collecting data in 2009. And in 2010, Dr. Barton and Kat Hoy, who was a master's student, started a hydrologic characterization and soil characterization of our state nature preserve. They were just trying to figure out, well, what's going on with these wetlands. At the same time, while they were doing the hydrologic and soil study, myself and colleagues at Kentucky Nature Reserves were setting up vegetation and orchid plots on all of our seeps. We installed permanent plots. We took data on orchid flowers, vegetative, fruiting. We knew browsing was a factor, so we were looking at browsing and fruiting. There's also data we collected on what I call aborted orchids, and I can talk about that in a little bit. Photo points. So this was all pre-management. And then at the same time, I'm not going to go into this hydrology study because I'll mess it up. But Kat and Dr. Barton were conducting their hydrologic study. And basically what they found was that this particular seep, and it might not apply to all of the white Fringeless orchid seeps, but at least at this one site, this is a precipitation driven wetland that had a shallow fragipan in the top 40 centimeters that helped percolate water. And that evapotranspiration was a main driver for loss of moisture. And that, let's see, in the off season, they were ponded. In the growing season, they dried up, and evapotranspiration increased tremendously. So from the hydrologic study and the soil characterization study, we knew that we had to open up the canopy to reduce evapotranspiration, and we had to try to slow some of the water down by creating debris dams. And this is also mimicking some of those natural disturbances like tip-up mounds and browsing as well. So that's what we did in 2013. After several years of collecting data every year on the vegetation and the orchids, the UK Forestry Club helped out with this. Nature Preserve staff, UK staff came out. We felled white oaks, cut all the red maples, did a lot of thinning in the mid-story and the shrub layer. With the larger white oaks that we felled, we created these debris dams and packed them with soil, maybe acting like a beaver a little bit. And yeah, that's what it looked like. And this is a photo point in one of our plots where you can see here on the left side is pre-management, and then management occurred, and you can see how it's very grown up, and then the progression of a more open system. So how did the orchids respond? They loved the disturbance. You wouldn't, sometimes you think like, oh, orchids, you gotta be sensitive. But these things really loved the canopy being opened. The hydrologic study showed that the debris dams increased the water table and improved wetland conditions. I'm not gonna report on the hydrology graphs post-management, but that is what happened. And then the orchids here's the management in 2013. Few plants, management 2 years later, skyrockets up. It's a cookbook, pretty easy management effect here. And same over here at our eastern seep, low numbers, management, and then the orchids shot up. So we have data from last year, so 2022. So there is 3 more years of orchid population numbers for this study. I just haven't updated these graphs yet, but the numbers are probably about at 350 now. And I think that they're leveling off. I don't think that it's kind of saturated with plants now. It's a pretty site. And then this also went up to about 200. So I think this one was managed in 2017. I think it's got a few more years to increase in flowers. So I mentioned that browsing was a big issue when there was a smaller population size, and browsing still was a huge issue even with the numbers up. But if you had 5 orchids and a deer browsed 70% of them, that's not good. But if you have 300 orchids and a deer browses half of them, you still have a lot of fruits to work with. So that's kind of what we saw here, in terms of, trying to figure out what to do about the deer. We do need to do maybe some targeted hunting and working with Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. We did experiment with fencing out deer, but that was not good because when you fence out the deer, then the shrubs aren't browsed as much. So that was that double-edged sword that I was talking about. And we captured that in the vegetation data. And then I was like, no, let's move these fences. But yeah, we just need to get the population numbers up. And so this is individual fruits. And so even with, if you go back to 2019, I guess that was, we got 50%, 15% browsed. Even with 50% browsed, you still had 405 fruits formed. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of seeds in each fruit. They're like dust. So browsing was not as big of an issue, although we're still tracking that. And not just the white Fringeless orchid, there's other orchids in these seeps as well. There's 2 other rare ones as well, not as rare as the white Fringeless, but all of the orchid populations increased dramatically. There's the white Fringeless here, Platanthera cristata here, that's a state endangered one, increased. And then this Calopogon tuberosus, the grass pink orchid. This was an interesting one in that when the site was first discovered, this plant was there and then it disappeared 2 years later. And then every year we would go to try to find it, and it's not there, it's not there. And then we did the management 2 years, and then 2 years after the management, it pops up. So it probably was laying dormant in the soil. It may have come back from seed, but it probably was just laying dormant as a corm in the soil, just waiting for conditions to improve. So that was a cool story. How did the vegetation community change? So we set up these CVS plots of Carolina vegetation methodology, in that we had 10 by 10 meters, and we cataloged all of the plants and the different strata within the 10 by 10 meters, and assigned abundance codes to all of the plants. And then we were able to look at pre and post, how structure changed, how species richness, floristic richness definitely changed. But more importantly, well, here's the herbaceous structure changed significantly. You know, pre and post management, you just get a lot more grasses and ferns and forbs, and obviously we were targeting the mid-story and the shrub layer, so that declined greatly because that's what we were targeting. So it worked really well. The community seemed to be to respond, but we were also interested in the quality, not just the number of species. We did get 1 or 2 invasive species that popped up, so that presented management challenges. But we're also interested in the quality of the species that were starting to pop back up in the seeps. And so for plants, there's these things called coefficient of conservatisms assigned to all the plants that based on their tolerance to natural processes or lack of natural processes. So, and then you can calculate these floristic quality indexes for sites. And for the sites that were managed, the FQIs increased. So more conservative, wetland plants were starting to move in and increase in these seeps. Something else I looked at was just overall mean wetness of the site. So all plants have wetland codes assigned to them, and then you can look at the shifts of the amount of wetland plants that are in these seeps. So the more negative of the numbers, the more wet it became. And so most of them did become more wet, but because these seeps are adjacent to barrens and more dry systems, they can be kind of schizophrenic sometimes. Like in certain parts of the year, you have wetland plants, but then prairie plants can move in as well. And so there was some anomalies here with this eastern upper seep, in that it got more dry plants in it. That kind of complicates the thing. Something that was really interesting in 2018, after we did the management and the center seep, a new rare plant showed up that we had not documented at the site before, and it was this coastal plain disjunct Lobelia natalii. And that was really exciting to know that our management provided the habitat for this rare plant in a new population. And we're still trying to figure out if it came from seed or how exactly it was dispersed. It's probably just was laying in the seed, laying dormant in the seed bank. And a lot of other things increased as well. Obviously, if you get more flowers, you're going to get more pollinators and insects, more aphids that we were seeing were affecting the plants, and that's a whole other thing. But yeah, dragonflies, spiders, snakes, lizards, salamanders, all that stuff increased. We didn't take data on it, but just visually and being there every year, particularly copperheads. A lot more woody debris. I got to know this copperhead really well, watched it grow up, have babies, reproduce, got to know its family. We respect each other very, very much, especially when I'm counting the orchids around its home with my hands. Megan has probably seen that one at least once now too. I briefly mentioned this adjacent upland community. And I think it's just really interesting, and it's also a treatment and affects a potential treatment that we're going to use to compare some of our future studies. So just down the road from these white Fringeless Orchid sites on roadsides and power lines, there's rare prairie plants and these remnant barrens and savanna communities. And I mentioned in these uplands, a lot of shortleaf that if it wasn't killed by the pine beetle, a lot of younger shortleaf coming in, historic kind of shortleaf pine savanna communities. But there's still, you know, some big shortleaf pines in these areas. The whole systems in the uplands are very fire suppressed. And so we were really interested, you know, we're micromanaging these seeps, but we're also looking at how we can manage the whole landscape for the seeps themselves. And so we started managing the adjacent uplands at our nature reserve, in addition to the wetlands. And this started in 2019. And we used a series of treatments, masticators, just hand felling, girdling, and then this is just a treatment that shows the different treatments and over the years. The seeps are here, here, and here, and then there's a couple here, so they're kind of embedded within these treatments. And then we were able to burn the whole site because we opened up the uplands, and it was a really hot burn and it was pretty awesome. But in 2020, we were able to burn the site, and now any day now we'll burn it again. And so that is also another confounding factor in how that's impacting the wetlands because the burns did singe around the wetlands. So we're looking at how to tease out, if we can even, probably not exactly what the effects are of these upland thinnings and fire. So expanding on this initial pilot study, so this initial pilot study will probably be a chapter in my dissertation. And then over the past couple of years, with increased federal funding and partnerships, and the fact that we did demonstrate through that pilot study successful management and recovery of these wetlands and the orchids, we've expanded the project over the past couple of years to all the populations in Kentucky on federal lands. So we went from one site doing our study, research, and management to now 7 additional sites. So that would be 8 out of the 9 sites in Kentucky. And so that's what we've been focusing on the past few years. So this was our initial site that we worked on, and now all of the other ones. So last year, or in 2019, and then in 2022, we started setting up plots in the rest of the white Fringeless Orchid sites. And the methodology is very similar to what we did at our state nature reserve. The timeline for this new expanded study started last year. It's going to go to 2027. We installed 46 additional plots last year, and then pulled in the mountain one, and that's pretty exciting. And we added fungal symbiont studies with Megan's work and increased restoration efforts there. And we're doing a lot more insect and pollinator studies. And entomologists at nature reserves are working on that. So in total now, we have 73 plots at 8 sites. This just goes into the timeline, but basically what I've kind of outlined that we did for our state nature preserve site, we're implementing on all of the new sites. A lot of them are on the Daniel Boone National Forest. I work a lot with Claudia Cotton and David Taylor on planning and you know, all of the work on the Daniel Boone for these sites. And we're currently looking at, we're still trying to tease out different treatment effects and exactly how we're going to do the management, because each site is a little bit different. We have a good idea of what works with our state nature preserve site, But a lot of the sites are, you know, have differences. So we have a site restoration, hydrology and soils crew. This over the next 2 months, I'm going to be working a lot with Forest Service folks to plan the management for each of the sites. And then this past year, this was our biological survey and plot installation crew. There's Megan right there. A lot of nature preserve folks studying insects. We did orchids, vegetation community, and fungi. And so I'm glad that we got all those plots in last year. That was a lot of work. Something new that just fell from the sky. It really didn't fall from the sky. I've been planning it for a while, but it feels like it just dropped. In 2019, I collected seed of white Fringeless Orchid and started a partnership with Atlanta Botanical Garden to grow plants. And they do micro propagation and have been working on selecting high quality seeps within the Daniel Boone National Forest that do not have white Fringeless Orchid. And later this year, we're planning on transplanting 500 plants into a new site. So that'll be a whole other study. And we're going to be developing this translocation study in the coming months. So that's a pretty exciting thing that's happening. Some additional studies that have kind of spurred from this that aren't necessarily going to be going into detail in my dissertation or anything, but these additional studies that we're working on, insect characterizations in these seeps. We really know nothing about the types of insects that occur in these wetlands. So we've been doing malaise and bucket traps, and I've been working with these entomologists and realizing that studying bugs is a lot harder than plants, in my opinion. Also, we're going to be formally documenting additional pollinators of white Fringeless Orchid. I've seen bees like Bombus pennsylvanicus and that green metallic sweat bee pollinating white Fringeless Orchid, but we've never caught it to actually see if it had plainia on it. So we'll be doing that. There's an aphid that we discovered last year was impacting the flowers of white Fringeless Orchid. And so we're looking into this crazy aphid. It could be a new species just associated with white Fringeless Orchid, who knows? And it would be cool if someone would do some animal studies. At this site, I know that a lot of things are changing in the uplands. The bird composition has changed. All these red-headed woodpeckers moved in after the management. But yeah, there's a whole other slew of different interesting studies that could come from that. Last year, Dr. Zettler came down and we extracted nectar from the orchids. And that was super cool. I'd never done that before. You know, him and his colleagues are going to be looking at the chemical composition of the nectar, and that can shed some light on pollinator communities and how and it can even change in different years, the chemical composition, depending on what pollinator communities they're trying to attract. There's been some really interesting work on the ghost orchid, similar to this. Dr. Zettler, we might also do an extract of the floral fragrance to see the chemical composition of that, which would be really cool. And then I can get that monkey-faced orchid perfume that we all want. And then another study that we're going to collect the leaf tissue for it, but this will be a future study of looking at the genetic diversity of white Fringeless Orchid, entering intraspecific population diversity. So in summary, all of this work, I think recovery of the species is definitely possible. Collaboration is definitely key. With any single species study, you always have to think about the community and all the different associates and how everything interacts. And definitely taking that larger landscape scale approach for management is the way to go, even for microhabitats. And I wanted to thank everyone here for coming to this seminar on this gloomy afternoon. And this is my PhD committee, Dr. Steve Price, Dr. Carol Baskin, who's here, Dr. Chris Barton, who is asleep. It's 2 a.m. in Australia. And I've been keeping him updated. He's on sabbatical and we'll be back in July. Dr. Larry Zettler, who is out of Illinois College and works with the North American Orchid Conservation Center. And then some key advisors here, Dr. Claudia Cotton. Some of you all might know her, soil scientist at the Dandenong National Forest. And David Taylor, who has been instrumental in all things white fringeless orchid plants and communities. And so many partners were involved in this project, a lot of different grants and organizations and agencies. And this is just a snapshot of most of them that have been involved in this project. And with that, I'll wrap it up. If you guys don't know, in Berea, there's actually a mural of white fringeless orchid that you can go and stand and get your photo in front of it as well. I can't remember the name of it's like in a park. But anyways, do you guys have any questions?
So,
All at once.
yeah, so the restoration effort looks like, especially with your added sites, looks pretty intensive.
Yeah.
So is this a forever maintenance always? Or do you feel like that are these little tweaks that can kind of turn the tide a bit back to a more suitable habitat?
Yeah, that's a really great question because, I mean, we don't want to be micromanaging habitats and I'm thinking that in the long term, if we could really manage the uplands and get them into a state that they're more of a woodlands and a barrens, and then we can actually use fire. And I'm hoping that every few years we could just run a fire through these sites and that would manage for it all. And that's the ideal version. I don't know if we'll get there in the next 5 years, but I think we could get there in 10 years. I think at our preserve where we started that earlier, that'll be a really good indicator. So yeah, that's a really good question. That's something that I think about a lot, how to manage a larger area. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you for coming. This is very interesting. You mentioned, or kind of touched on this a little bit with the fruit thing you mentioned, but I'm curious if you've done anything a little bit more beyond the fruit in terms of demographic monitoring of these plants. Have you monitored individuals through time? I gather they're perennial species, so you could potentially mark individuals and monitor their survival. And well, if they're having thousands of seeds, recruitment might be more challenging, but have you kind of tried taking maybe a demographic perspective in some of these populations?
Yeah. So there has been past studies by Dr. Zettler who looked at, individual plants, and they do move a little bit, and definitely we had thought about that. For demographics, we're looking into the vegetative plants and now separating them out into seedlings, first year, second year, third year, and that kind of gives us a proxy of, okay, well, there's fruits, there's younger vegetative plants, there's flowering plants, so that kind of gives us kind of an age structure there. But because some of the past work and some of the more, I guess, we're trying to focus mostly on what we thought were limiting factors or issues, and I think that the structure, if you could just get the habitat back, I think that the life stages even out. So, anybody else?
Sarah, I don't have a very well-formed question. But as I'm reflecting on your seminar, I'm thinking, wow, this is interesting. You start with this population that is disappearing that you're interested in conserving, and then you follow the thread, and that thread leads to upland forest management. And so so this is where I'm unable to fully form my question, but I guess my question relates to whether you have a thoughts on or perspectives about how national forest management kind of unfolds. I think of it as being, well, let me just preface it by saying I have amazing respect for our national forest managers, and I think they're doing a really good job, but I'm just wondering how this approach, starting from conservation of a single plant, could lead to a shift in the way that we think about upland forest management, and whether you see any of that shift unfolding in the management framework for the Danube Lagoon or other federally managed lands.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, there's mandates. I mean, this is a federally listed plant. And so, you know, if it's on federal lands, you know, these are high priority for the federal system, for the federal managers. So I am seeing over the past year or two, you know, I'm talking to fire managers about this, and they're open to it. They're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That overlaps with our objectives. So there's a lot of overlapping objectives of different groups of people: biologists, managers, people studying rare species, people managing for oak regeneration, you know, all kinds of things. But yeah, I definitely do see a shift. I do.
And maybe even to like, yeah, that's kind of what I was asking. And then also like maybe a shift in thinking about the landscape scale, right? Like I think we often think of burn units in this way that's disconnected from the larger landscape, but this work really points to the importance of those connections, and those connections through disturbance, of course, but now we have management emulate disturbance.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Just a natural history question. So, and you kind of said you didn't want to get into it, but I'm asking anyway. How confident are you that the swallowtail is the pollinator? And the reason I ask is that it looked like maybe Aguichlora pura, maybe you had on there.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
And you mentioned Bombus pennsylvanicus. Those are well known to be really good pollinators. Whereas butterflies are kind of notoriously horrible pollinators because the reason you mentioned, they've got those long legs and those really long proboscis.
Yeah. Well, we can visibly see the plenia on the swallowtail's eyeballs. It's giant. It's freaky. It would really affect me if I had that on my eye. But we've seen them go back and forth just visually. And we know that if there's flowers, there's viable fruit. And so we do know that it's being pollinated and pollinated effectively when there are flowers. So we assume that most of it is swallowtails, but that's what these new insect studies I hope are gonna to shed some light on that. We're doing a lot more moth work and lepidoptera work, and it would be so cool to see if there's some type of sphinx moth that would more effectively fit into the flower and pollinate it more effectively. But because that's not like a driver we know that it's forming viable fruit, so it's not like the main driver for a conservation question. Yeah, but it's super interesting. Back in I think it was in 2007, I did see a hummingbird moth, and I got like a horrible photo, and I was by myself, and you know, I'm not good at catching critters too much, so it could be something like that, like a hummingbird moth. It's kind of a sphinx moth that might be able to fit into that, and those are generally declining. Just sphinx moth in general, insect fauna in general, I guess is. But yeah, it's super interesting. I'm hoping we'll have more information on that in the coming years. So,
thank
you. Yeah.
When about do they emerge, and then about how long do they last for?
Yeah, so the leaves are up already. The little vegetative leaves, they come up pretty early in the year, usually by like March, April, and then In July, they'll shoot up a bolting flowering stalk, and by late July, they're flowering, and they'll flower till the end of August, and then they'll fruit in October.
I had a quick question. Can you hear me remotely over there?
Yes, is this Larry?
It is he. How are you? I enjoyed your talk. Did my voice carry enough there?
Yes, we all hear you.
Okay. I enjoyed your talk and had a few things I wrote down along the way. First of all, the nectar samples that we collected on the visit there, I guess it was this summer, are being analyzed as we speak right above my head by the chemistry department. And so I'll certainly keep you in the loop on what things you find in the nectar of this species. Referring to the bees that like the little halictid bee, maybe that little green thing, and also other Hymenoptera that show up at those flowers. I would be very surprised if you see pollinia on any part of their body, but it doesn't mean it you couldn't find it. But I suspect this thing with the long nectar spur is Lepidoptera pollinated. I have seen silver spotted skippers with numerous pollinia on their eyes from this orchid. So anything that shows up that's not Lepidoptera, and I suspect would be maybe a, what do they call those things in pollination? The thieves or something. They're there because it smells good, and maybe they can steal by chewing into the nectar spurs. So it would surprise me, but I'd say, look around and look for pollinia. I have a feeling the pollinia, as you said, are so large that anything small like a little green bee would have a hard time flying at all if it got one of those on it.
Yeah.
Another thing, I just wanted to reiterate that the species you've chosen to study, and your goal is to, basically bring it back and make it thrive. You've chosen well. It's a user-friendly orchid. And back in the Stone Age, when I was a grad student working with it, it's a good thing I chose this one. Otherwise, I'd be cooking hamburgers now. So you've chosen well, and I think what you have proposed to do will check the boxes, as long as everything continues to go forward. I just had two other quick follow-ups. I didn't catch you saying anything about Lygodium. I remember that nasty climbing fern in one of the sites. It was very thick. I don't know if there's any plans to control that, if you can. And I don't remember anything about wild pigs. Do you guys have wild pigs up there in Kentucky to worry about uprooting the root system?
So yeah, so we do have wild pigs in Kentucky, but luckily they're not in this area. Fingers crossed, we will know if they're in the general area, and we'll plan accordingly. But that has not, in the past or the present, been a threat or a factor in the plateau. In far western Kentucky, like in the swamps, that's an issue, but currently not in the eastern part of the state. And so that was hogs. Lygodium, that's a huge problem. Climbing fern in one of the power line sites. It just about looks invasive, like the invasive one, but it's not. It's the native climbing fern. And we're thinking of just torching it. I don't know. It really is so thick that we don't really know what to do. That site is under a power line. We're removing woodies, and then everything just gets carpeted in it. We're hoping maybe to torch it, and maybe that will knock it back. Other than that, I don't know what to do about it.
What invasive species are you seeing, and how are you guys handling that?
So microstegium is a big one. And then we also have to worry about that on our boots when we're walking into these sites. So we take a lot of precaution there. We do a lot of hand pulling when we're doing the vegetation surveys. And then our land managers also help with those efforts as well. Multiflora rose is popping in. So those are the two big ones at one site. Since we're in the planning stage at the DBNF sites, we're doing a lot of mapping of existing populations of invasives in the pre-management stage, and thinking a lot about how things could move into the seeps once we manage them. So So there's a lot of that going on. Yeah, microstegium is, I think, probably the worst one that we're dealing with. All right. Well, it's 2 o'clock. So thank you everybody for coming, and hopefully the next time you hear us talk about this, we'll have even more data to go over. So thanks everybody for joining us.